My name's Larry Maccherone, and you can see the title of the talk here. So let me kick it off with a little bit of an interesting quote here. So us Americans, big pirate fans, and we like to attribute this quote to a British captain. So Captain William Bligh, Mutiny on the Bounty. It's actually not really a quote from him. There's no record, at least, that he said this. But there is a record of an American naval captain actually saying something relatively similar, that there will be no liberty until morale improves. And the idea here, though, is sort of a metaphor for how security deals with developers. There will be no freedom to empowerment to do what you need to do unless we get security. And the reality is that the empowering of developers is actually the key to getting more secure applications, just like leave and no beatings are probably important to having good morale. So that's a little sort of interesting start. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. There's a number of icons that are going to come up here, sort of tell a little bit about my background. But there's really sort of two things I think you really need to know about me. First of all, I was the head of application security for Comcast for 5 years. Over the course of those 5 years, I transitioned from a policing, gatekeeping approach to application security. You're not going to get into production unless you pass the security, audit, the pen test, whatever it was, to a developer-centric approach. The results were amazing. 1/6 as many vulnerabilities found in production for the teams that had been through my program versus the traditional AppSec program. So I was essentially stood up to compete with the internal other AppSec program. By the end of my 5 years, though, we had moved all 600 development teams. By the way, Comcast is a U.S. headquartered international communications conglomerate. You may or may not have heard of Comcast, but you probably have heard of Universal Studios. You've probably heard of Peloton. You've probably heard of, maybe you've heard of NBC, maybe some television shows from NBC. And we also own Sky, or Comcast owns Sky. So I shouldn't say we, because I no longer work there. It's just habit for that. I work at Contrast. So 600 different development teams, 10,000 developers. So I was able to shift from a gatekeeping policing mode to a developer empowerment mode over the course of 5 years of that big of an organization. So, and there was a lot of learning. I didn't get it right at first. We made a lot of mistakes. We learned from them. We adapted them. And now I'm talking to folks that sort of want to do this shift left DevSecOps thing at their organization, small and big. And I'm sort of helping them with that. The second thing to know about me is that I'm a developer. I write code literally every day. I'm the primary author of a dozen open source projects, one of which gets 1 million downloads a month, is used by basically every cryptocurrency exchange and wallet out there, as well as used by Amazon and AWS, I should say, and Azure and GCP and anyone who you know of who needs a sort of high security data store or data and analytics. They're probably using one of my open source projects. In a lot of cases, when I meet with clients that I'm consulting with about DevSecOps transformation, they're using one of my libraries. So data and analytics are all my libraries there. So enough about me. I'd like to learn a little bit about the folks in the audience. It's a little hard because the lights are pretty harsh. So I'm going to hold my hand up over this light when I look here and ask for show of hands. Don't raise your hands yet, but I want you to raise your hands, and you can raise them multiple times or keep them up when I go from one to the other. So how many of you write application code? Pretty much everyone. Is there anyone here with their hand down? What you, sir? What do you do? Are you? Okay, you just didn't raise your hand. Got it. Okay. It's a small enough audience that I'm going to notice. So sorry about that. How many folks are responsible for sort of configuring your pipeline, right? Code for pipelines. So most everyone. So very DevOps-oriented audience here. Very good. How many of you are responsible for, or at least involved in, application security? That's well, I guess the talk title sort of attracted all of you that are at this conference to come to this talk. So that's great. So this is perfect. You're the ideal audience for this message. So I'm a little less disappointed that there's only a handful of you here, because I check all the boxes of what I'm looking for here. So there's this term DevSecOps has gotten, I don't know, poisoned a little bit by a lot of people claiming to be DevSecOps. And a lot of them are just claiming to put DevOps lipstick on a traditional security pig. And that is not how I define DevSecOps. So for me, it is, the key word in this definition is empowerment. And basically, it's empowering engineering teams to take ownership of the security of their products. But that's only sort of the first of three important parts here. So the second important part is that these folks are doing DevOps. And I don't mean DevOps that, hey, we just have a CI/CD pipeline. That's, of course, a necessary element of DevOps. I really am thinking more about the three ways of DevOps from Gene Kim's writings: flow, feedback, and a culture of experimentation and learning. And it's these three things are actually key to pulling this off. And I think they appeal to developers too. Even if you didn't think of these as your primary definition of DevOps, even if you thought of the tooling one, I do think that you're probably also attuned to these three elements that Gene Kim says are essentially the heart of DevOps. Oh, one more thing, by the way. And then the last thing, and this is really important, it is DevSecOps. It is not DevOps. We have to keep in mind that your value to your organization is in delivering functionality in the form of code that your users benefit from. And that is the most important thing. And it should be secure also. But you can't say security comes first, because it doesn't. If you have no customer data to secure, you don't have any need for security. So you have to have a product out there doing something useful and that you need to protect first. Now, maybe at the same time is probably the ideal way, and I'm going to push you more towards that, actually, as we go. So I mentioned Gene Kim's three ways of DevOps. This is a picture of Gene Kim and myself. Gene Kim has reviewed some of my earlier work before he published the Phoenix Project. Actually, he and Nicole Forsgren, who's the author of Accelerate, sort of very active in some of my Agile transformation work that I had done prior to that. And these are sort of like my favorite quotes from Gene Kim. And I'll touch on some of these, but I'm not going to harp on them now here. So. But these are a lot of what I've borrowed from Gene's philosophy here. The other thing I want to sort of mention is that I was the founding director of the Scilab at Carnegie Mellon University, where the Software Engineering Institute is located, where the U.S. CERT, Computer Emergency Response Team, where essentially a lot of the U.S.'s most advanced cybersecurity research occurs. I was a founding director of a research consortium there to do this. I was awarded a $1 million prize as a fellow for the Los Alamos National Labs, which is the place where they develop our nuclear weapons. So I helped to secure U.S. nuclear weapons. So I've done some really serious top secret clearance kind of work, including for the NSA and other organizations as well. But I had this idea that we needed developers to be much more engaged in security 25 years ago. And so I went to launch this thing called Build Security In. And some of you may have heard of the BSIM, the Build Security In Maturity Model. I don't know, that's a derivative of the build. Has anyone heard of it? Is that one person has heard of it? Yeah, so here. But I would actually say the BSIM was fundamentally failure. We failed to change the culture of the development organization to be worthy of being trusted with the ownership of security. And so I got very frustrated, and I left
the security world, and I went to the Agile transformation world. This is 20 years ago or so. You guys, how many of you are doing what you would sort of think of as Agile or post-Agile development? Not pre-Agile, yeah. So almost all of you as well here. So Ken Schwaber had just written his book, and he was just started teaching when I was in his class to become a certified Scrum Master to do that. And I did that because the Agile movement was gaining traction. They were hooking into developer psychology and development team sociology. And so I got to the point where I was speaking on the circuit for Agile transformation, similar to this talk at conferences like this, except Agile talks. And I would speak about how the QA departments that are now a silo, that are separate from development, they're going away. And the development team are the ones who have the biggest ability to impact the quality of the product. And so they should be the ones empowered to do it. And you shouldn't rely on a siloed organization to do this. I would leave the stage and walk out into the hallway, and the QA people would chase me out there and say, you're all wrong. You know, my job's not going away. You know, and so when I give this talk at security conferences, I get the same reaction. They sort of follow me out there, like, no, AppSec's not, and it's not going away. Just like QA hasn't really gone away, but it's been fundamentally disrupted by this movement towards empowered engineering teams. And I think this sort of also happened, maybe to a different or lesser degree, with the DevOps movement and the cloud native movements. They've fundamentally disrupted IT ops. And I think security is next. So this feels like deja vu to me. And I'm back in the security world. I've left the Agile transformation world. I'm back in the security world for the last 7 years when I went to Comcast to try to do this transformation there. Okay, so there's a couple of sort of criteria that I want to talk to that directly speaks to development teams. Are you ready to take ownership of the security of your products? And so what are the criteria that sort of like the minimum criteria I would expect you to be meeting in order to really do this well? And so one of them is that you have at least started on the path towards automated testing. So how many folks do not have an automated test suite for the application they're currently working on? And would you raise your hand if you don't? You two don't. Okay, there. Do you want one, or do you not think it's worth it? Not needed? Why is it not needed? So if there's bugs, you let your users be your testers. Oh, fair enough, fair enough. That's a good example then for that. For the rest of you, I assume you have at least the start of an automated functional test suite or unit test suite that maybe does a little bit of sort of doesn't completely mock all the services. Maybe has some sandboxed services instead of mocked services. So the old concept of unit testing is everything had to be mocked except for the thing you were testing. That's no longer really the way you do unit testing even today. So you have to have it. This is a prerequisite. Here's a really interesting thing that I didn't realize until we started helping development teams write their first test. So I stood up a service at Comcast. This is the security department, the application security department. I stood up a service that any development team can sign up for a pairing session with one of my engineers. By the way, I didn't employ security people. I employed essentially all developers or Scrum Masters to do all of my work. If you had one of those security acronyms after your resume, you did not get hired on my team, or at least the resume went to the bottom. You only had to have development practice, or you had to have coaching sort of experience in order to get onto my team. But you could pair with one of these engineers that worked on my team, and at the end of the pairing session, you would end up with a single Hello World end-to-end test using something like Cypress or Playwright. Is anyone using Cypress.io? Good. Anyone using Playwright here? Some folks. Anyone using Postman here? Are you using Postman in a manual mode or in an automated mode? Has anyone used Postman in an automated mode rather than just a manual mode? Okay, so by the way, a lot of people aren't familiar with this. I use Postman all the time in a manual mode, but I actually use other tools for my automated tests against APIs. But Postman has a really robust, you can write and rerun test scripts in Postman nowadays. But anyway, so we would help the team write one of these end-to-end tests in one of these testing frameworks, or Selenium, or some other testing framework that they wanted to use. We had recipes and experience to do anything they wanted, essentially. And if we didn't have it, we would learn it before we went and met with the team and helped them write it. The test would get past the login hump. So a lot of tests that sort of just hit public endpoints don't really do a lot. But you have to log in to try to get the app to do stuff that really is concerned for security. At the end of this, we would install the test. We would install a blocker, a status check in the pull request that would essentially make sure that if the test ever failed, it would never get merged. And then we also installed a test coverage metric blocker as well. So if the test coverage ever went down from the last baseline merge to master or main, then it would fail as well. So basically, the test coverage had to always go up from this point forward. So the teams would write new functionality, and that would increase the denominator of the test coverage percentage, which would make the percentage go down, and so it would fail. So they'd be like, oh, I have to write an automated test. Why do I have to write an automated test? I want to just get my pull request merged, but okay, so how do I write one? Well, I'm going to copy this example Hello World one that Larry's team helped us pair and create, and I'll make it test the stuff I just wrote. And this service resulted in teams in about 6 months got up to, on average, over 80% test coverage, something like 82, 83% test coverage by just having these three things. The really interesting thing, though, is that the Hello World test often got them up to 25% to 35%. When you think about it, all the startup code is exercised by a Hello World test. All of the login code is exercised. All of the access control code is exercised. So it's actually a surprisingly large percentage of the overall code base that gets exercised by a single Hello World test. It gets harder to grow from there. The second test doesn't add another 25 to 30%. It might add 3 or 4%. So you need a lot more after that to get up to the top levels. But that's sort of motivating, that you can get pretty far pretty fast with just a single Hello World test. And these three blockers, these three status checks, will then give you a cultural motivation to keep that going and improve over time. And so this is sort of a key strategy that we used. I mentioned that already. So this last bullet is, I say, must be completed prior to the pull request merge decision. I actually am not, it's more of a strong should than a must for me here. So ideally, what you want to do is you want to have this test suite run in the CI pipeline, and that gets run every time a pull request is created and updated. And so a lot of folks are using static analysis tools or have test suites that take too long to do in that mode. And so I would encourage you to parallelize your test suites and use faster security tools, which I happen to work for a company that has the fastest security tools. So to sort of make that possible, to make that merge. Because that feedback, that motivation is key. I mean, I've got some slides later that sort of talk about why it's important to do it there, right there, not later in the process, not after you deploy to a QA environment. Okay, so why are functional tests so important for security? Well, there's really sort of like two main reasons for this. First of all, software composition analysis, SCA, is CVEs, is finding vulnerabilities in the libraries that you're using. And so if something like Log4Shell comes out, how many of you folks were working in Java in an organization that got hit by, okay, you guys, how fun was that when that happened? It was not fun. It was a mad scramble, right? What version of Log4j were you on before it hit? Was it a breaking change between the version you were on and the update that fixed the thing?
We have a huge variety of applications, so there was a mix.
A mix, okay.
There were definitely teams that felt the pain.
To fate the pain, right? Yeah. So like you couldn't upgrade quickly because it would break, the versions were different enough that it would break your application to upgrade to the latest version, which had the patch, the vulnerability removed. And so it's very, very painful for those folks. So it's imperative that you get to the point where it's just the course of doing business, that it's sort of like the norm, that you're no more than a few minor sort of versions behind on your dependencies. The only teams that are able to do this are the ones with automated functional test suites, because when a new version comes out, you automatically try it in your pipeline, and if it passes all of your automated tests, you're like, well, we may as well do it. But if you don't have an automated test suite and a new version comes out, you have in the back of your mind, oh, hey, it might break our app, and we won't know if it breaks our app until we put it in there and it gets tested by our users. That means you're not very unlikely to stay up to date. You're not going to take that risk because it's too costly. So automated functional test suite takes that risk down to zero, essentially, for you to stay up to date with the latest version of that. Although every sort of patch level update, nobody is going to stay up to date on. You would spend all day essentially doing that every day. So you can batch it. So the rule on any team that I work on, all the contributors to my projects have to sort of, we have these working agreements we establish, and we can change them by agreement for the whole group. But one of the more common rules for most of my projects is that when you pull a new card from the to-do column into the in-progress column, the very first thing you do is you upgrade all of the dependencies that pass the automated testing. So you're expected to run npm space outdated if you're in a node environment and see which ones are outdated. And so it's just the course of doing business to do that. You upgrade them, you run the tests. If they pass, then you don't do it. If they fail the tests, they might only fail like one or two, and you can easily see where it broke. So sometimes folks will actually just fix it then even. So it actually helps even in situations where the upgrade does break your app, but it only breaks it in a small way, and you're sort of willing to the culture is strong enough that you're willing to do that. So that's a reason why automated test suites are important. The other is because the very best application security tools on the market are not SAST tools, static application security testing tools. They are IAST tools. Intelligent is the I, or interactive is the I, depending upon who you ask. Application security testing tools. And IAST tools require that you have a test suite in order for them to work. Basically, they're not going to crawl your app and look for data flows that are potentially vulnerable. They're going to observe actual data flows and tell you which ones are potentially vulnerable. And so you have to have pretty good test coverage. Pretty good means 35% or better typically, though, to outperform a SAST tool. The other nice thing about SAST tools is, other than the fact that they're accurate, much more accurate than SAST tools, is that they run at the speed of your automated test suite. When your automated test suite is done running, you have all of your security results. And so it's basically real time with that. There's no waiting for hours sometimes for SaaS tools to run across a big project. As soon as the test suite is done, they also automatically parallelize as well. So in order to use the very best SaaS security testing tools on the market, IaaS tools, you have to have a test suite in order to really effectively do that. So you should probably have a test suite anyway for most applications for quality reasons. This just makes it doubly more important. Yes, you have a question?
Is it still useful to use a SaaS tool as well?
It is common to use a SaaS tool. One sort of hole in IaaS coverage is client-side, browser-side code. And so it's often common to run something that captures for that. But the reality is that the only real risk that is sort of only in the browser and that isn't mostly in the server is certain kinds of cross-site scripting. And the best way to protect against that is with content security policy, CSP headers. And so if you have strong CSP headers, you don't actually need to run any scanner on your client-side code because all the risk is on the server side then in that case. So we have a SaaS tool that will scan JavaScript code for you that we sell with our IS tool that you can use to do that. But for the most part, it's really a fraction of the risk of the server side, and sometimes it's zero if you have strong CSP policies. Okay, so how do you get here? So I basically walked through this already. First of all, you need a team working agreement that says, hey, we want an automated test suite, and we want it to eventually get to 80% plus coverage. And we're going to use this gating approach to get there. We're going to gate on whatever the current test coverage percentage is. If it ever drops below that in master or main, the primary, the trunk, if it ever drops below that, then we'll block the merge. So as you write new functionality, you're expected to add some new tests that go with it. So you need this agreement on the team to do this before you go. If you don't believe it's important, if you don't believe it's valuable, and you don't believe it's the right thing to do, you're not going to get this agreement. So, but security is also probably a lot lower risk for you guys as well as quality is a lot lower risk for you guys as well. You can break up the work if you have automated testing employees that just work on automated testing. I don't recommend you sort of get rid of those folks. I recommend you let them write the non-happy path tests. But I actually think it's really important to get developers to write the happy path tests. And we really need mostly the happy path tests for an IaaS tool to work. So we care about that more at contrast. But so either way works. And the non-happy path stuff is usually in that 20% that's not tested in a lot of cases, right? That's usually where the gap between 80% test coverage and 100% test coverage is actually. So the blockers are critical, and this pairing service is a great idea. Most of the companies that I help adopt this approach don't have the security group do this pairing service. I was a very sort of unique situation. Most of the time, it's some DevOps team that does this pairing service. That their job is to help mature development teams technically, and they are leaders at their organization, and they help them do this. Okay, so the next prerequisite is ephemeral build and test infrastructure, and parallelized tests, so they run fast enough. So, and I'm going to do a show of hands here, and I want everyone to raise their hand for one of these two things if you do automated testing at all. Do you wait until the tests, the code is deployed to a QA environment, and it's a static environment that's maintained all the time to run your automated tests right now? Show of hands. How many people do it this way? No, one. Okay. Do you have your pipeline stand up ephemeral instances of your application and all of the necessary services in sandbox mode in order for you to run the tests in the pipeline? Show of hands to do that. Okay, more than not. And then there was about a third that didn't raise their hands at all. So I wonder what you're doing. Anybody want to share what they're doing? And if they didn't raise their hand either time of those? So.
There is a localized environment on the machine that can run most of the end-to-end tests.
That's a good answer too. So you can run an IaaS tool on your local environment, and if you're running them during that, it'll catch everything just like if it were an ephemeral. That's actually a good answer. Is that the answer for the remainder of the folks that didn't? Okay, good. That's a good answer too. So I'm going to modify my slides after this. That's an acceptable alternative to my first bullet there as well. By the way, what I recommend you do if you want to move to doing it in the pipeline is I do not recommend that you take the QA environment and try to push it backwards into the pipeline. I recommend that you take the development environment and you try to push it forward into the pipeline. It's a much easier lift to accomplish that than to accomplish the QA environment. And usually when you say we're going to put the test environment in the pipeline, the folks who run the QA environment, they freak out and they're like, this is impossible. We'll never be able to do that ephemerally. There's lots of maintenance that goes into it. And yeah, it takes engineering work. But the reality is that most developers have solved that engineering work. I can make a copy of a good test data set and repopulate it and push it back to the original state. A lot of developers have that already worked out on their machine. And that's the stuff that the QA folks think is difficult to move backwards into them. And this parallelizing thing is not critical if your test suite runs in 5 minutes anyway. But once you get up to test suites that take an hour to run, it's imperative that you parallelize them, or you're never going to be willing to run them in the pipeline. That's just going to slow you down too much. So the good news is that Selenium and Playwright and Cypress.io have essentially automatic parallelization. You just have to configure it right with your CI system. If you use GitHub Actions, the Cypress docs for that, within a few minutes, you can turn any test suite into a parallelized test suite in Cypress. And you just tell it how much GitHub Action units you want to spend, how many machines you want to spin up, and it'll spend it. Or you actually, Playwright has a feature where you can say how many minutes do you want it to take, and whenever it passes that number of minutes, it'll increase the number of parallelizations. So this is automated in a lot of cases, and so if you have a Playwright or Cypress test suite, it's sort of easier. And Selenium has something similar, although everything in Selenium is harder because it's a lot older framework and there's a lot more things piled onto it. And so it might not work with some Selenium plugins that you're using or Selenium wrappers you're using, the parallelization. So you have to sort of worry about it a little bit if you're using Selenium. Okay. I already sort of mentioned this. Actually, I'm going to skip past this slide. It's mostly a duplicate of everything I said, except it's written out longhand. So you have it if you ask for the slides. By the way, if you want the slides, connect with me on LinkedIn. I can't show my cursor for some reason. The LinkedIn is right there in the lower left corner. It's not basically on every slide of this, if you don't get it now. My name is pretty unique, though. Maccherone. If you search for Larry Maccherone on LinkedIn, I'm the only Larry Maccherone that's likely to pop up. So connect with me on LinkedIn and send me a message when you ask to connect that you attended the talk and you'd like a copy of the slides. So this slide talks about why the pull request is the ideal place to do this. So you guys all code, right? You sometimes get a good feeling. I mean, you wouldn't be coding if you get a good feeling when you write something that's elegant. You like it, right? The code you wrote this morning is something you're pretty proud of most of the time, right? 3 weeks later, you're not so proud of it anymore because you wrote new code that morning, and that's even better than the code you wrote 3 weeks ago. So if I give you feedback the day you wrote the code in the pull request, the code you wrote that morning that you're trying to get merged, get accepted, the pull requests get accepted that afternoon. If the feedback comes back before the reviewer even gets a chance to see it, the feedback runs sort of pre-reviewer step, then you're going to fix it fast. And the code is fresh in your mind. And you are passionate about that code because it's the way you're producing value for your company. It's what you're proud of. You're likely to do the work necessary, even if that means you have to go learn what an SQL injection is because it says you wrote one this morning and you don't know what that is. If we provide a link in that feedback to a quick lesson, which we do, that will tell you what an SQL injection is, and in a few minutes you can understand how the code you wrote it was an SQL injection and what it would take to fix it. And it's usually pretty trivial to fix with these things. 2 or 3 minutes of learning goes a long way. And then you never write that again. That learning is very deep because it's contextual. And I will talk about that in a little bit, why that's important. There's another sort of thing that I like to talk about, and this isn't as important as sort of the other slides in this section, but I included it because we had a full hour, and I do think it's sort of a more advanced approach. I have this thing for advanced teams I like to talk about called the defect, incident, vulnerability 3-step. Basically, if something goes wrong, you want a retrospective on why it went wrong, not to assign blame. So blameless postmortems are a big part of DevOps culture, right? You don't want to assign blame, but you want to put in place some change that prevents something like that from ever happening again. And so that's where the 3-step comes in. You don't just fix the thing that was found by the tool, you find and fix others like it in the rest of your responsibility, even if it's not in the same code base. If it's another product, but you did something, you did something similar in another product. Maybe you add a rule or you do a query that says, hey, are there any situations where we do this or we call this a library and we don't do this other thing before we call this library? And you very quickly sort of find and fix those. That's maybe 10x effective than finding and fixing the one that was found. But the 100x effective is if you put in place something that prevents you from ever doing it again in the future. And often that 2 to 3 minute learning that occurs when you fix it the day you wrote it is all you need to do, because that developer will never write another one like that again in all likelihood. And so this is an important advanced concept. And it leverages this concept of contextual learning. The research on contextual learning goes back 100 years. It was primarily targeting K through 12. Actually, that's a phrase you guys might not be aware of over here. Elementary school, the primary school. What's the word you guys use for kids when they're 4 years old and they go to school till they're like maybe 16, 17? High school? Anyway, that age group. Most of the research on contextual learning is targeted there. But there's a few folks like me who have done some research and adapted it to professionals. And so this is my interpretation of contextual learning for professionals. By the way, these 3 words, these 3 pillars of contextual learning are the 100-year-old version, not the adapted version. Situated, social, and distributed. The words below that are my adaptation of it. Basically, situated means it's needed for your current activity. I can't get my pull request accepted until I fix this vulnerability, and I can't fix this vulnerability until I learn why the code I wrote is a vulnerability. So that's situated. Social means that it's part of the social norms of the group that I'm a part of to do this, to learn this, to know this. So the fact that you have a working agreement that sort of talks about doing this is sort of satisfies the social aspect. But it becomes cultural after you have the working agreement. Or maybe it's cultural and then you write the working agreement. Doesn't matter which comes first. It's distributed, and this is where the network effects come in. If you have this learning and you're the code reviewer on somebody else's review, it sort of spreads, the knowledge spreads. And so when all 3 of these things are present, are true, which happens to be true in the pull request, then you get that sort of rounded triangular shape in the middle. I call that the hedgehog of contextual learning, because the rounded triangle is roughly the shape of a hedgehog's head, right? So the hedgehog of contextual learning is when all 3 of these things are true. And the traditional way of teaching cybersecurity to developers fails fundamentally on this concept, and that's why most of it is ineffective. I published a study at the RSA conference in 2020 that showed that 3 of the 5 training programs that Comcast had in place for security for developers were net negative of value, meaning we put more money into them than we got risk reduction out of them. And so, and that's because they were basically send the developer to a course or have them listen to an online thing and answer some questions, and that is completely ineffective. The 2 that were effective were a war game, a gaming situation where it's developer against machine. You have to actually solve the attack kind of thing. And Secure Code Warrior has a product like this, and Code Bashing has a product like this. There's a few others out there. Secure Code Warrior is partnered with us, and that's the one our product integrates with. So that's the one I'm probably going to push you to. And this just-in-time training that occurs when you have a vulnerability found, it links to a 2 to 3 minute lesson that sort of teaches you the answer. But that these are the sort of the 2 that were effective, and the other 3 were not effective, not worth the money at least. Okay, so you're developers. You're not security people for the most part. Actually, I think there might be one person who gave answers that made me think you were. You over here. Does anyone here work in security primarily? So you 2 in the back there. Well, you've worked for my company. You work mostly in security. Okay. So this is a message to the developers you work with on how to manipulate you. I mean, influence you. So close your ears if you don't want to hear this next part. You need a set of practices at your organization, a policy, so to speak, about application security. Often these come from borrowed sources like NIST and OWASP and PCI, etc. And these are awful places to start if you want developers to actually do the things that are mentioned in there. And these are the reasons. They don't all say the same thing. They target security specialists in terminology and sort of the approach. They fail to specify adaptations needed for developers to actually be happy doing these things. And they're overwhelming. Even the OWASP one, which OWASP you would think would be the most developer-oriented sort of supplier. The primary OWASP AppSec manual is 400 pages long. It's overwhelming. A developer sees that and they don't even read past the first page because it's just way too much. And it's not prioritized, even in that 400 page. It doesn't say, these 3 are the absolute most important. These next 3 are the second most important. And then the other 394 are less important than these first 6. That's what developers need. They need to know what's the next 3 most important things they should work on. And you only feed the development team those 3 things. And you get them. And I say the development team. I mean an individual 2-pizza development team. 2 pizza, that phrase means you can feed the team with roughly 2 pizzas. So if you try to do this with a policy you apply across all of your development organization when you have more than 10 development teams, let's say, you will fail. You have to treat every development team on a separate maturing journey. You have to meet them wherever they are now, and you have to help them along the path as fast as they are willing to go. But that pace is going to be different per team. And you have to treat them as individual entities that you're trying to help mature in order to pull this off. They fail to consider the developer's unique context. So instead, what I have you do is I host this half-day workshop. I can do sort of an hour or 2-hour long version of it for free, but the half-day version that gives you a deliverable at the end of this list of prioritized practices, that we charge for at Contrast. And I've been doing this a lot across the industry, and so a lot of folks take me up on this. Basically, what we do is we make sure that the 3 to 5 most respected engineers in the organization are in the room, and the security leadership is in the room. Now, normally when policy manuals are written, the security people write the policy manual and then they give it to the development team. But I have them not start with a draft. I start with a clean slate, and we do it all with Post-it notes on the wall. And we don't do it as just the security people doing it. We do it as with the engineers in the room as equal decision makers in what the policy manual will say in the end. And when I say policy manual, I'm going to show you one. It's going to fit on one slide. The fonts are not very small. You'll be able to read them. Here, that is essentially what I'm saying. It's not a 400-page anything, and it is completely prioritized. You can do this in about a half a day in a single room with these folks. Now, the reason we want the most respected engineers in the room, we don't want the VP of engineering if he hasn't written code every day for a while. You don't want some PowerPoint architect in the room, you know, maybe they're the highest paid person in the development organization. You want the tech leads that all the other teams wish they were on that team, that wish they were developing that app, that wish they had that tech stack. You want the ones that are sort of the most respected in the organization. Why is that? Well, if a policy manual comes down from the security group, the average developer in the organization is going to go ask these leaders and say things like, well, do we have to pay attention to this or not? And the leader who wasn't involved in writing the policy manual says, yeah, I've read it. They asked me to review it. I gave them some feedback, but you know, it's just another one of those things that comes from security, and we'll do the best we can, but you got to keep shipping product, okay? And so that's not a very strong endorsement, and you don't get cultural transformation that way. But if they're in the room when it's being created and there was no preconceived draft of it that they got a chance to give their feedback on, but they got to help write it from scratch, essentially, they're going to advocate for it. They're going to say, I was in the room when we created that list, and that list is solid, and it speaks to developers, and it is, I don't just, you know, sort of want you to do it. I'm not just going to say that because that's what I'm supposed to say. I really think this is the right thing for us to do as an organization. That's the kind of advocacy you get when you have those folks in the room. And you do not get it unless they're in the room. So we collaborate with Post-it notes on the wall. Again, you can have your own ideas come into the room, but you're not allowed to pull up the NIST document and show it if you're a security person there. You have to extract the 2 or 3 things you think are most important out of the NIST document, and those are the 3 you're going to advocate in that room, because there's 6 to 10 people in the room when we do this workshop. We don't just identify the list of practices, we identify what is necessary in order to make this the path of least resistance for development teams. I want the right thing to do to be the easy thing to do. So I have an example at Comcast when I started. There was a rule that said, thou shall not hard code secrets in source code repositories. We ran a scanner on our GitHub Enterprise Edition. There were thousands of embedded secrets in there. So we started, you know, they started blasting, the traditional AppSec folks started blasting nasty grams to those development teams saying, you got to get that stuff out of there. And the teams would say, well, where do we put those things? And the security team was like, oh, I don't know. Team over here is doing something, where they're self-encrypting, and where do they store the keys? Well, they share them in a notebook file that's on a shared drive. And no, that's not. So I said, let's remove this from the policy expectation. Let's set up a CI integrated secrets store, HashiCorp Vault, and we will expect folks to use Secret Store. Nowadays, secret vaults are sort of baked into every CI system, and you sort of take it for granted they existed. But 7 years ago, when I started this at Comcast, there was not a single secret vault integrated with any of the CI environments that we were working with. So we had to create that in order to make it be the easy button. So this workshop will identify situations like that, where there's a gap between what you expect people to do and what's easy for people to do, and you have to close that gap. And until you close that gap, that thing is weighted 0. And so it basically is on the list, but it's not expected to be worked on. It's weighted 0 at that point, until you close the gap between the easy button. Usually this is work for the security group to do, by the way, not the development organization to do. So that's good news for you developers here. Then we try out the list on 3 to 5 real development teams. We do this within a week of the workshop. That's critical. Often I can go on site for 2 days, like pre-COVID. That's the only way I did these. I would go on site for 2 days. I would do the first half day. The first day was the workshop. The second half day of the first day was the first development team. And the next day we did 2 more development teams. Sometimes we could do as many as 5 in 2 days. Depended on a lot of factors, scheduling factors usually that made that happen. And we learned a lot because we would think we had great wording of the practices, and then we would try them out on your developers, and they were like, no, we misinterpreted what that meant until we got an explanation, so we need to clean up the wording. And we flesh out the single line description of the practice with a paragraph or two usually as a result of this trying it out on development teams. And often we'll change the weighting, and often we'll change the list of practices a little bit because we tried it out with development teams. We often will also, the weighting gets changed most often because we reduce it to 0 because there is no easy button. We think there's an easy button coming out of the workshop, and then we try it on our team, and they're like, there's no way we can do that without it costing a lot, and it's not worth it for us. So you're going to have to, not expect us to do that. So here is an example list of weighted practices. By the way, every time I do this, I get a different list, but it's 2/3 to 3/4 exactly the same concepts, different words that match the wording that they sort of are familiar with. And the weightings are fundamentally different frequently. So you see these percentages at the beginning. This is absolutely important because we're going to gamify this list. We're basically going to meet with each individual development team and saying, hey, here's the deal we're trying to make with you. We're going to expect you as a development team, this is a coach from my organization, from the security organization, we're going to expect you, and your bosses have signed up for this, the engineering bosses have signed off on this, we're going to expect you to adopt 1 to 3 of these practices to the point where it provides real risk reduction value every 90 days until you cover most of them. And we'll decide what most of them is. And we're going to gamify this. So the team with the most improvement in each 90-day period is going to be on a leaderboard. And there's going to be prizes, and there's going to be contests and challenges and that sort of thing. We gamify the whole thing. And this is highly effective to the point at Comcast when we did this. We can do this at the individual team level, but we started doing it at the business unit level. Like maybe there'd be like 10 development teams in each business unit, 5 to 15 development teams in each business unit, let's say. We had 2 business unit leaders that were best friends. They basically started at Comcast at the same time. They were on the same team when they started, and they became tech leads and grew the ladder and became engineering managers over 10 teams by the time I came on board. And they basically liked this concept. They really bought into it, and they challenged each other. My group of 10 teams will have more per average point improvement in the next 90 days than your group of 13 teams. And the loser has to wear a bunny suit to the cafeteria for all 5 days during Easter week and walk around the cafeteria for at least an hour in the bunny suit. And so this challenge this was a better reward than a pizza party or a raise or anything in getting attention, because the entire company saw this person walking around in a bunny suit. What was that? They got to ask, and it created a whole movement at the company. That we didn't suggest this. They basically came up with this idea on their own. But we did suggest these challenges. We would pick sort of 3 groups of teams, and we would say, hey, you guys want to join a challenge to be the most improved in the next 90 days. And the percentages at the beginning here are the points you would get. If you got to culture, and I'll explain what that means, for that you got those points. And that was how we measured the improvement. So we're down to 7 minutes, and I still have a few more slides. So I'm gonna move a little faster here. So what's the criteria for a good dev-centric AppSec tool? First of all, speed. We talked about this a little bit. If it takes too long, you're not likely to run it in the pipeline. And the bottom line here is that SaaS tools, the length of time it takes goes up exponentially with the size of the code base. It's not linear. So if you double the size of your code base, the SaaS scan takes 4 times as long to run. And so it quickly gets out of hand when your application grows. IaaS tools scale perfectly well with your test suite. And if you parallelize your test suite, they automatically parallelize. You can't parallelize a SaaS scan. It has to run the whole thing on the whole app all at once. You can do incremental static analysis though, and that can speed it up to the point where it can run in a pipeline a lot of times. It's fidgety sometimes, the incremental scans, but there are a couple of tool vendors that have gotten this down to the point where it's pretty usable. Accuracy is also important. If you have false positives, you're going to waste developers' time. They're not going to trust the tool. They're gonna sort of be frustrated at the fact that it said it was a vulnerability, but I can see it's obviously not a vulnerability because there's no way to get to this point in the code. And the SaaS tools get it wrong 30 to 70% of the time until you tweak the rules for your code base. And IS tools are essentially never wrong. They can be incomplete, so there's false negatives with IS tools because if you aren't running a full test suite, you're not going to have full coverage, and we might find something later when you add a test that explores a part of the code you weren't exploring before. But for the most part, you're going to have near zero false positives with IS tools. So that's the bottom line there. And this favorite IS slide basically repeats that. So what I talked about coaching. So does anyone recognize this guy right here? Anyone recognize that character, TV show character? Nobody. You do. Who is that?
I don't know the name, but I've seen him as an actor.
He's an actor, yeah. Yeah, there's a TV show called Ted Lasso. It must be an American thing because it's on Apple TV, and I don't know, maybe you guys don't have Apple TV. It's only on Apple TV. But anyway, this is an American football coach that gets hired to lead a European football team, UK football team, Premier League football team. He knows nothing about soccer. He only knows about American football. It's a total mistake that they hired him for. It was malicious. Somebody hired him intentionally to sabotage the team. But it turns out he's a pretty good coach because it doesn't matter that he doesn't know much about cybersecurity or soccer. It only matters that he knows how to get the best out of people. He knows how to get them to want to improve. He knows how to get them to work together. And so these are the people that do this workshop with the individual development team. The folks I hired for this role at Comcast, the first 3 people I hired for this role were all Scrum Masters. So they're people that were working with Agile development teams. They're used to sort of helping them improve their practices anyway. And the practices just shifted from Agile practices to security practices. That was essentially the only change there. This is the maturity model. Every practice goes through these 4 thoughts, words, actions, culture progression. Sometimes very quickly, within a few weeks, typically you can get through some of these. Thoughts means we haven't put much thought into it. And maybe today, the first meeting with the coach is the first time they've heard about it. Words is we're making plans. We're talking about how we would do this. Okay, we would have to change this about the pipeline. We would have to get licenses for the tool. That's words. Culture is we're halfway through, partly way through implementing it. If you have 3 apps that are qualified for this kind of scanning tool, then you maybe have done one of them. That's actions. And the other 2 are pending. And culture is, for every reasonable opportunity to do this, you're doing it. You wouldn't think of starting a new project without doing it this way. That's culture. You only get the points when you get to culture. So that's a real important aspect of the gamification. And I tried it giving you partial credit for actions, and it was less effective. So we switched it to getting to culture. Teams stalled if we did it that way. So I talked about this coaching workshop that we conduct. The coach meets with the development team. They don't show the entire list of 13 to 14 practices with all the percentages day 1. The first meeting, the first 90-minute workshop with the team, they don't show them all. They show them one at a time. And they have a conversation with the team about them. Do you do this? Okay. Have you talked about possibly doing this for the future? Okay. If you do it, well, pull up the records. Let's see how it's running. Oh, yeah, we're running the scans. Well, you still have a lot of open criticals. Oh, yeah, we're running the scans, but we're not resolving them. You get no points for running scans. You only get points for resolving the findings at a certain policy level. So you get some points for criticals, some points for highs, some points for mediums, right? So you have to at least solve all the criticals to get any points, because otherwise the tool is useless. Running the scan is just a waste of our money and time if you aren't going to resolve this stuff. So you have to be clean in order to get the points. So anyway, so it's a conversation with the team about each of these practices. And the conversation is focused on what would it take for you to adopt this? Which apps that you're responsible for is it appropriate for? Because not everything is actively developed, and so it doesn't have a pipeline, and you're not going to build one, you're not going to write a test suite for it, but you're still responsible for bug fixes on those apps. So you don't want to do most of these practices on those apps. You only want to do them on the apps that you're actively developing for the most part. And so we talk about that, and we're focused on planning. Once the coach finds 3 to 5 things the team could do, stops. There's no more talking about the rest of the things. And the order that the coach presents them in is a judgment call that the coach makes, taking into account the team's current situation and the weighting that we had. So they're going to propose the highest weighted ones first, or the ones that are prerequisites for the highest weighted ones. They're going to propose as the first practices. But you stop talking to the team about the list of things they're doing wrong as soon as you have 3 to 5 opportunities for improvement. So the team doesn't feel overwhelmed, and you immediately shift into planning mode so that you basically get the team to talk about what it would take to do this in the next 90 days. And at the end of the session, you ask the team to commit to 1 to 3 practices. No more than 3 you're going to commit to. Even if there's 5 you think you're going to do, we're only going to ask you to commit to 3 in the next 90 days. And we're going to track whether you do it or not. We're going to tell your boss about your commitment. We're going to tell the organization about your commitment. We're going to follow up 90 days later. We're going to have a workshop every 90 days. The second and through N workshops are only 60 minutes long, so it's not a big burden on the team. It's also not a big burden on the coach. A good coach can do 10 of these a week, 10 of these workshops a week, and it's a different set of 10 teams each week for 90 days. So a good coach can cover a maximum of 100 teams, which is a very efficient use of a coach's time. It's also a very efficient use of the development team's time as well. And then come back every 9 days and sort of make another improvement. You can track progress globally on this. These are sort of visualizations that are built into the Transformation Blueprint open source tool that I've got out there. By the way, I'll have a slide up in a few slides. You can sign up for a beta of this tool that renders these visualizations and walks you through this coaching process, walks you through the creation of your list, all of that. So I already talked about how this scales up to 100 teams. We gamified coaches as well. So coaches were dinged on not meeting with the teams we gave them a little bit of buffer. So it was 120 days was the official time. You got full credit if the gap between any team's 2 workshops was less than 120 days, you got full credit for it. So we were targeting 90 days, but 120 was acceptable for the coach to get full points. And we were rewarding the coach for their success in the team actually adopting the practices they committed to in the meeting. By the way, in that commitment, we have the product owner in the room for the workshop. Just like you need the engineers in the room when you develop the list of practices, you need the product owner in the room when you commit to adopting the practices, because the product owner is the first person you go to when you say, do you support this commitment? Often the product owner will say, no, I do not support this commitment. We've got this roadmap features to get out. Well, what could we modify about? You saw the team's enthusiasm that they want to do this. What product owner, what would you modify about this plan that would cause you to be accepted, to actually support it? Meaning you'll do everything in your power to make sure you achieve it. You'll schedule those stories in the sprints. Well, let's do 2 of those 3 things. Or let's only do it for these 2 apps instead of all 3 apps. And so basically you get that buy-in and you get that success. By the way, we're out of time. I went a little over. So this is my link to transformation.dev. If you go there, you can sign up for the beta of the visualization for this. That's a summary of the deal I said you were making. This is a slide, my one slide about my company that I work for, Contrast. We have a comprehensive platform for doing this across the entire sort of development lifecycle, including into production. So I don't really have time for questions. It's a little intentional with the way I designed it because we have a booth right out there. So as I leave the stage, if you want to follow me, we'll head over to the booth, and I'll answer questions there. I'll take all the time we need to get to everyone's questions there. If you don't have time for that, I mean, there's 20 to 40 minutes, I think, between now and the next talk. Then please connect with me on LinkedIn, and I'll be glad to answer them there as well. Thank you.